Hi, this is Justin Coletti from Sonic Scoop. Thanks for joining me for this week's episode of the Sonic Scoop podcast. And today, let me paint a scenario for you. You're working on a track. Maybe you're mixing a track and you're working on a vocal, or maybe you're mastering a record. Whatever the case may be, you're putting plugin after plugin on this track, processor after processor, tweaking this thing, tweaking that thing. And after 10, 15 minutes deep and 5, 6 plugins deep, it definitely sounds different, but does it sound any better? And after all of that work, maybe it sounds different but worse. And how can you tell if it sounds better or just different? I've got to say, I have sometimes made things sound different but worse when I was trying to make them sound different but better. And every once in a while, you know that the key is to leave things alone and not make them sound much different. Well, I've got a strategy for you that I want to share today that's going to change the way, I hope, that you listen to your mixes and your work in audio production. And you have a better idea of how to always make things sound better and not different but worse, which sometimes happens when we're in there, zeroed in, tweaking away. And there really is a concrete process for this that you can adopt. Maybe you've experienced in the way that you've been working on Mix for Final Revision 8. And you're like, wait a second, did Final sound better than Final Revision 8? And how do let me just go back a few revisions. Good thing I have all these save as's. And I want to cut down on that kind of thing in your life and keep you from going down rabbit holes that lead you nowhere. This is something I've suffered with myself, and I want to say I've largely overcome it. But one of the reasons I'm recording today's podcast episode is it still happens to me, and it was happening to me just the other day. And I want to share the solution that I forgot to implement, and then once I implemented it, it worked for me, just like it always does. Before we get into it, super brief shout out to our sponsors. Big sponsor on this one, Soundtoys, sponsoring this podcast from the beginning. Try out any of their super awesome creative mixing effects over at soundtoys.com. You can try them for 30 days, probably the most generous demo period in the whole pro audio business. Also, big shout out and thanks to Focusrite, making some of the best bang for the buck interfaces out there. Check them out over at focusrite.com, from their entry-level Scarlett line all the way up to the high-end RedNet series. Last quick, totally shameless plug is if you want more strategies and ideas like these, I've got something totally free for you. You can get the 5 Habits of Every Great Mixer, a free workshop that I've done over at sonicscoop.com/mixhabits. That's sonicscoop.com/mixhabits, where you can learn the 5 things that all of the top mixers that I've interviewed, studied, produced masterclasses with do in every single mix. Well, some of them do only 4, but most of them do all 5. Check that out over at sonicscoop.com/mixhabits. Also, if you prefer a free workshop on mastering, we've got that too over at sonicscoop.com/mastering101. That's sonicscoop.com/mastering101. Of course, there's also the full-length courses, Mixing Breakthroughs and Mastering Demystified. Both come with a full money-back guarantee. I know you're going to love them. You're going to change the way you mix forever in the case of Mixing Breakthroughs, for the better, faster, with more confidence than ever before. Or if you want to know everything I know about mastering, Mastering Demystified is the course for you. All right, onward into today's topic. This was actually happening to me just yesterday in mastering, where I was working on a client's project and I made all of these changes and I got it to a place where it sounded different. But did it sound different and better, or different and worse? And should it sound just really a lot like the mix with very few changes? And in this case, the answer is yeah. I had to back off on a considerable amount of the processing that I did to get better results and ultimately make the client even happier. And there are a lot of producers, engineers who have come to this realization that sometimes less is more, and backing off is super important, and respecting what the artist or producer who's on this project ahead of you did on it. That's the name of the game. I remember the first time I really experienced this was when I was a budding engineer in my early 20s, and a kind of older mentor, a guy named Rick, who'd worked with some really big producers and engineers and artists. I was working on a vocal track and it just wasn't sitting properly. And I was, of course, 5 or 6 plugins deep and outboard processors and all this stuff. And I'm like, I just can't quite get it right. He said, let me see if I can tweak and help make things sound a little bit better. It wasn't unsolicited. I actually asked him, can you help me with this? What would you do on this vocal to make it sit? And he ended up taking everything off of it and putting on one EQ and one compressor. And the EQ basically did one thing. It was like a low shelf. and maybe also a high pass. Like that was it. And all of a sudden it sounded way better than, the 12 things I was trying to do. And sometimes I catch myself doing this today, putting way too many processors on and then bringing out the more experienced person in the back of my brain and say, nope, step back for a second, take them all off, start again. And the big thing that you do is listen. Actually listen and evaluate where something is and where it needs to go before applying anything. So there's two fixes to this. There's a fix that comes before you make the mistake, and there's a fix that comes after you make the mistake. Before I give you exactly how these work, and they're really simple tools that you can integrate into your own process right now, I just want to give the disclaimer that I'm not telling you never use 4 or 5 or 6 or 12 plugins or outboard processors on a vocal or a master or whatever. I'm not saying never do that, but I think that when you start with the idea of how can I get there with the fewest steps possible, it's going to force you into doing step number 1, which is the fix before you make it different but worse. And that really simple process is to stop fiddling, to stop looking at the controls, to stop staring at the screen for a second and just listen to the sound and evaluate what exactly needs to change. Does it need to be darker? Does it need to be brighter? Does it need to be edgier? Does it need to be smoother? And only once you've come up with that determination of what about the sound needs to change, then you start thinking about what particular class of processor might be making that change and what particular settings or which specific processor might work. But that actual step of stopping and listening and making a note, a mental note in your head about what needs to change before you fiddle, will often keep you from going down that rabbit hole of throwing one thing after another, hoping that one of those things will fix the problem where you haven't defined the problem yet. Right? I think it was maybe it's misattributed to Einstein, but someone was asked, if you had 30 minutes to save the world, what would you do? And the answer is spend the first 25 minutes defining exactly what the problem is and how to fix it. And then in those last 5 minutes, you implement the fix and hopefully you really dramatically save the world right when the timer gets to 1 second, because it wouldn't be dramatic if you just stopped the timer at 2 seconds. That would just be bad writing, I guess. Anyway, that's the process to keep you from going down these rabbit holes. But sometimes you find yourself really far down the rabbit hole and you need to figure out, okay, I have done all this processing. It does sound different, but I'm running into this confidence problem of, does it actually sound better or am I making it sound different but worse? How do I figure out whether I've gone too far down the rabbit hole and whether I need to actually back up? How do I get objective about this sound? Because it's hard to get objective when you're the one who put on those 4 or 5 or 6 or 12 different processors and you're the one who made those decisions. You want them to be better. You want the answer to be right. You want to not have to go back and say, everything I just did was stupid. Let me undo it. Let me admit that I wasted a bunch of time. You don't want that to be the answer. So it's hard to get objective. So how do you get objective? And I think there are 2 ways to do this after the fact. And one of them involves, again, this magical thing I just talked about, listening, stopping the fiddling and listening to a long segment and stopping the mode of going back and forth doing rapid A-Bing. Rapid A-Bing can sometimes be useful. But when it comes to this kind of question, and a lot of the questions in audio, it really is required for you to stop, step back, at bare minimum, scoot the chair back, preferably even get up from the chair, maybe sit in a couch in the back of the room or like stand in the doorway and just get away from the controls and listen to the passage. A relatively long section of the passage, maybe a 30-second passage. That's actually a fairly long time to stop fiddling and sit there and just listen. Let's start counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You're already getting bored, right? Even if there's really good music playing in the room and music that you like, when you're in fiddling and messing with stuff mode, it's hard to stop and just listen and do nothing else for 30 seconds. But that's the length of A-B that you want to do to figure out if it's different but worse or different and better. You want to do your A/B over some length of time, at least 10 seconds, maybe 20, maybe 30, if you have the patience for it, 90 seconds of one way, and just feel how it affects you on an emotional level. Stop listening for tone for a second. Stop listening for the tonal back and forth, which one is more impressive or less impressive change, which one matches a reference more closely change, and just physically feel how the emotional arc is of the song, way A and way B. How do you respond? How do you feel over a significant length of time? At least like an 8-bar section, if not longer than an 8-bar section. And do your A-Bing, your back-to-back listening over that extended period. And that is a good way to do it. The other good way to do it, if you must do a more rapid A-B, is the super fast mouse click. You click it a bunch of times so you don't know if you're listening to A or B. You close your eyes. I don't know how many times that was. It was an even number, an odd number. Let me do a few more just because I don't want to make sure that I do a rhythm that I'm used to. Okay, is that one better? Or is this one better? And that gets the emotional baggage of I'm the one who put on those 4 or 6 or 8 or 12 plugins, so I want it to be better my way, and will force you to be more objective about which way actually sounds and feels better. And if you can incorporate those two strategies together, the blindfolding yourself when listening to A and B and the doing it over a significant period, then you can make a good objective decision about whether you've made things different but better or different but worse. And this is important to recognize because, honestly, these days for me, the easiest projects are the ones that used to be the hardest for me. When I used to get records that weren't produced very well and weren't mixed to the level that that producer or that engineer really wanted to get it to, and they wanted me to help finish it, say on the mastering end, or on the mixing end, if it wasn't recorded super well and they really wanted me to take it to another level on the mixing end, like that's a tall order, right? And those projects used to be so hard because you'd be trying so hard to fix things, right? To, I hate to say it, but polish the turd kind of thing, right? And those projects used to be so difficult. But now they're not so difficult because I've done enough of them where I know how far something can be taken in a positive direction and at what point you want to stop and stop over processing things. And the projects like those are actually easy for me now because I know I can dazzle the end client. They gave me something, it sounds okay. I give them something, and even though it's not up to my, the standards of how great it possibly could be, it sounds way better. And there's like a night and day difference between what I did and what the client sent. And they're super happy because it sounds so much better. And I'm thrilled because they're super happy with how far it went and how great the result is. Those are the relatively easy ones now. And you're going to find as you get to a higher and higher level, what actually becomes difficult is when something is so great that so often your job is not to mess it up, to not make it sound different but worse, to make it sound the same but better. And that's what threw me for a loop on this project. It was so good, and I made all these changes that could have impressed a client, but weren't enhancing the emotional impact of the actual song. And we're taking it too far from the direction of where it originally was. And I had to back myself off. And that becomes a challenge. The better you get and the better clients that you end up working with and the better collaborators you end up working with, you're going to have to tell yourself more and more often, hey, let's find places to lay back and not do anything. And let's make sure we're making things sound not different but worse, but maybe the same but better. Or maybe just the same, at least for some elements and in some cases. All right, well, I hope that one was useful for you. Have you ever experienced this problem for yourself? Do you have workarounds on it? What are some of your biggest challenges? Is it the ones where you have to put on a ton of things, or the ones like me these days where you have to do less and less and remind yourself that sometimes your job is to be a little bit more transparent and sometimes your job is to really dig in, and the trick is knowing which is which and when to do each. Big shout out and thanks to our sponsors, which include Soundtoys. Check out anything they make for free for 30 days over at soundtoys.com, making some of my favorite creative mixing effects in the known universe. Also, big shout out and thanks to Focusrite, making killer bang for the buck interfaces, some of the best values out there, from the entry-level Scarlett series all the way up to the super capable, super high-end RedNet series. If you want free stuff, we've got those free workshops, the 5 habits of every great mixer. You can get it at sonicscoop.com/mixhabits. That's sonicscoop.com/mixhabits, or Mastering 101, which you can get for free over at sonicscoop.com/mastering 101. Of course, there's the full-length courses, Mixing Breakthroughs and Mastering Demystified. Think they can change the way you work for the better forever. They come with a complete money-back guarantee. Hope you check them out. Thanks for hanging out with me on this week's episode of the Sonic Scoop Podcast. This has been Justin Colletti of Sonic Scoop. See you next time.